everybody. Welcome to the final presentation of the 2020 International eConference on Religion and Holocaust. I'm Dr. Darren Slade. I'm president of the Global Center for Religious Research, which is the organization that's been hosting this year's conference. And I want to say thank you to everybody who has showed up for this three-day event. Your support means the absolute world to us. It has been really encouraging to see how many people have showed up. We've had students and scholars and specialists from all over the world. All 7 continents have been represented at this weekend event. So thank you so much for your support. We have been able to hear some of the most remarkable and latest research in Holocaust studies this weekend. So it's been phenomenal. With that said, I have the distinct privilege of being able to introduce our next guest speaker, Dr. Jason Eberl. He is going to discuss historical and contemporary eugenics. Now, Dr. Everell is professor and director of the Albert Nagy Center for Healthcare Ethics at St. Louis University. He is a specialist in the philosophy of human nature and its application to issues at the margins of life, as well as ethical issues related to end-of-life care, genetics and healthcare allocation, and the philosophical thought of Thomas Aquinas. He is the author of several books, including Thomistic Principles in Bioethics, the Routledge Guidebook to Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae, and The Nature of Human Persons, Metaphysics and Bioethics. And that's actually the book I want to highlight for you right now. This book, The Nature of Human Persons, Metaphysics and Bioethics, this is an incredible book that discusses philosophical topics such as, is there a shared nature common to all human beings? And if so, what essential qualities define human nature? Indeed, does human nature require an immaterial mind, a physical body, a functioning brain or soul? And what's required for a human being to continue existing as a person despite undergoing physical and psychological changes over time? If you get a chance to check out this book and purchase it, I highly recommend it. In fact, and I will click this now, Dr. Everell has been kind enough to offer everybody a 20% off discount of this book. And there's 2 ways you can get this discount. You can go to the file section and download the flyer, which has the coupon code on it, as well as a link to where you can go to purchase the book. Or you can use the link right here in the offer section as you're viewing the presentation. Just make sure you use the promo code 14FF20. It's written right there on your screen. 20% off of Dr. Eberl's book there. Thank you so much for offering that. And with that said, allow me to turn it over to my good friend, Dr. Eberl. You have the floor, sir.
Great. Thanks, Darren. And thank you, everyone who's tuning in and listening. More than happy to pass along the publisher's discount, conference discount on my book, especially considering it's kind of overpriced, I think. Those of you who purchased it and read it can tell me if it was worth the value or not. Okay, so I going to start the slideshow here. So yeah, let's just get right into it. Want to definitely leave plenty of time for Q&A, probably because I'm covering a lot of territory in a short time. And I also apologize up front that for a conference that's focused on religion and the Holocaust, I only have less than a third of my slides are about the Holocaust specifically, and only even one of those mentions religion explicitly. But we will talk about different religious perspectives on contemporary practices of genetic selection or genetic modification, and this sort of new movement known as transhumanism. And so again, we're going to be starting from historically before the Holocaust, kind of talk about some things that led up to it. We'll talk about the themes that animated the historical eugenics movement, the lead up in the 1930s in Nazi Germany to the Holocaust and the Holocaust itself. And then we'll shift gears to contemporary practices related to genetic selection and design. So, the word eugenics, first of all, it comes from Greek, and as we'll see in the next slide, one of the first eugenicists, at least in recorded Western history, was a Greek. It comes from the Greek word genos, which means birth. We get our word generation from it. And then the Greek prefix EU means good. So good birth is what eugenics means. Another example, think of the Greek word thanatos means death. So euthanatos, euthanasia, good death, right? One of the philosophical touch points throughout my presentation will be Friedrich Nietzsche. Themes underlie the historical eugenics movement, in particular during the Holocaust. That's not to say that Nietzsche, if he were alive, would have been a supporter of the Holocaust or its practices, or even that the way people were reading him or taking inspiration from his thought at the time is an accurate representation of Nietzsche's thought. So certainly during the discussion, if there's anyone listening in who has greater expertise in Nietzsche than I do, maybe we can get into that a bit more. But as I said, you do see some Nietzschean themes pop up. So for example, Paul Kohn, a eugenicist from the early 20th century, specifically invokes Nietzsche and Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, the surpassing of humanity's current condition, which for eugenicists like Kohn wasn't simply about Philip there who, from his portrayal of the genetically enhanced Khan in the movie Star Trek Into Darkness. I could have put Ricardo Montalban, the original Khan, but from my daughter's perspective, Benedict Cumberbatch is already an Übermensch of strong and beautiful body. So out of deference to her, I used his image. As I mentioned, the concept of eugenics goes back in terms of Western philosophy all the way back to Plato. In Plato's Republic, which a lot of you may be familiar with, in which Plato, through the mouthpiece of Socrates, sort of lays out his vision of an ideal society. And of course, again, people who've read and studied this know this is more or less allegory for human psychology, human moral psychology. And so isn't necessarily about an actual political plan that Plato thought may even been workable. But within his plan, he talks about the members of the guardian class who were both the physical defenders of the city, and then also some of the guardians were trained to become the rulers of the city. And he had very strict eugenic controls for the guardians. And the two quotations you see here are reflective of eugenics. One being what's referred to as positive eugenics, not positive in the sense that's necessarily good, but positive in the sense that's it's seeking to promote good genes being passed on. So again, Plato says the best men must have sex with the best women as frequently as possible. And then the other side is what we would call negative eugenics, preventing the passing on of quote unquote bad genes. So the opposite being true of the most inferior men and women. And then furthermore, if a child is born of inferior parents or the child is born defective, it's not really what we would say today, but this is a translation of Plato, they'll hide in a secret and unknown place as is appropriate. And that is a euphemism for basically exposing the child out in the woods to the elements and let the wolves have at them. Okay, so infanticide for quote unquote defective children. And again, an example of what we would call negative eugenics. Again, not simply because it's bad, it is, but also because it's seeking to eliminate the passing on of certain genes. Now, as I said, Plato's Republic never lived and spent the first part of my career, passed the world's first negative eugenics law, in which those deemed unfit by the government and health officials were forced to undergo sterilization. This primarily impacted mentally disabled persons in state hospitals. This law was a similar type of law was adopted by several states in the ensuing years. Virginia's law came under scrutiny in a lawsuit that went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court and in 1927, in the Buck v. Bell decision, eugenic sterilization laws were deemed to be constitutional. As Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes put it in writing the majority opinion, 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. And imbeciles, by the way, was a technical term used by psychologists at the time and public health officials to declare people at different levels of mental ability. So there were idiots, there were imbeciles, and so on. The Buck v. Bell decision, by the way, has never been formally overturned. So technically, it is still, such sterilization laws will still be constitutional in the US. Although after all the horrors of the Second World War and Nazi practices came to light, pretty much every state in the US and every country around the world that was practicing eugenics rolled back their laws. But between 1907 and 1945, about 40,000 eugenic sterilizations were performed in the US, about half of them in California, sent after having given birth at the hospital. So as I mentioned, there's both negative eugenics, which sterilization would be about, and then there's also positive eugenics, about promoting, quote, good stock and encouraging people to have as many children as possible. And this is a picture from actually the Indiana State Fair, where they would have these better baby and fitter family contests. So, you bring your giant pumpkin, you bring your prize pig, and you bring your awesome genetically sound family. And of course, there are cash prizes, get your name in the paper, all ways of encouraging people to go and have more children. Now, let's shift gears into the Holocaust. From the very beginning in Mein Kampf, Hitler stated that it is the job of the state to see to it that only the healthy beget children. And for those whose German is not up to snuff, quick translation of the one poster there says that God cannot want that the sick and disabled reproduce into more sick and disabled. And then I think I have to translate the word on the next slide. Again, as a form of positive eugenics, the Bronze Honor Cross of German Motherhood was awarded to, again, fit women who had 4 or 5 children. That's the bronze level. Gold for those with 8 or more. So again, encouraging people to have more children. So let me step back. As I mentioned, Nietzsche's kind of a touchstone here. And again, with the caveat that this is, I'm talking about how Nietzsche was being read by the Nazis and other eugenicists at the time. Basically they, saw the promotion of the new German Volk, the new human beings. And in this quotation from a Nazi physician, there's a reference to the transvaluation of values, which is a direct reference to Nietzsche's concept of going beyond, which again means not necessarily spiritual in a religious sense, but spiritual in the total person, including the body. So again, reading Nietzsche, his exaltation of masculine virtues, strength, cunning, ruthlessness, and so on. His derision of Judeo-Christian virtues such as patience, meekness, and humility, and so on. And then we have Nietzsche's famous proclamation that the fundamental driver of all human behavior and all human history is the will to power. And as part of that, you see he says, what is bad? All that proceeds from weakness. And he says, the first principle of our humanism, that the weak and the failure shall perish, they ought even to be helped to perish. And again, this is a concept very much adopted by eugenicists in general, but the Nazis in particular, because while in other countries like the US, you had, again, these forced sterilizations in accordance with laws that are being passed at the time, there were no direct killings, at least none that were legally authorized in these other countries. But as we'll see in a minute, the Nazis did institute killing practices prior to the actual Holocaust itself. Again, a lot of what I'm referring to is stuff that happened before the actual mass extermination of the Jews began. But that's also certainly part of this entire Nazi eugenic. Another concern at the time was a utilitarian or economic concern. This is something even from a high school biology textbook that talks about, the burden, the financial burden on people to support sick and disabled other persons. So in a 1920 survey, so this is even before the Nazis came to power, right? But this was a survey done in Germany of 162 parents. Would you agree to the painless curtailment of the life of your child if the experts had established it was suffering from incurable idiocy? And 73% responded affirmatively. So obviously not a huge study, not necessarily scientifically valid by contemporary standards, but certainly disturbing from the perspective of how many parents would be willing to end the life of their child. And keep in mind, they're not talking here about abortion, right? Abortion obviously becomes a more modern practice of prenatal selection, something we'll get into later on. But I mean, this is about, euthanasia, about infanticide. So based on what seemed to be broad popular support, the Nazis instituted what became known as Action T4, the T4 euthanasia program, in which about 200,000 persons with mental and physical disabilities were killed. They used phrases like lebensunwürdiges Leben, life unworthy of life, ballast lives, useless eaters, and Ausschuss-Kinder, garbage children. After the war and the Nuremberg trials were happening, 4 of the 23 Nazi physicians who were tried, the other 19 were tried for participation in the extermination camps or for engaging in illegal experimentation. But 4 were specifically tried for their participation in the euthanasia program. And 3 of those physicians were convicted and executed. Now here's where religion gets directly involved with the T4 program. Bishop Clemens August von Galen, the so-called Lion of Münster, who was kind of a constant thorn in the Nazi side throughout the war and throughout their entire time in power. I'm not going to read this long quotation, but this is from a sermon that he gave on August 3rd, 1941, in which he explicitly, publicly denounces the T4 euthanasia program. And this led to an outcry not only in Westphalia, where he was, but throughout Germany, such that the Nazis actually halted the program. It's one of the few times that public outcry at a Nazi practice led the party to actually stop doing something. Although it did continue in an unofficial capacity, more underground capacity with mobile euthanasia units. The Holocaust, among the many victims who were terrorized, victimized, exterminated, of course, the Jews bearing the brunt of that, but they didn't go after only Jews. Homosexuals were targeted, Poles, others, and have been forcibly sterilized by 1945. About 5,000, mostly women, died from forced surgeries to do the sterilization. Another kind of horrific way they did sterilizations, you would be called in to the physician's office for some reason. So the state had selected you to be sterilized, and you were called to a facility. And you know how it is when you go to a doctor's office and you have to stand at the front desk and fill out all the paperwork and everything? Well, imagine you're standing there at the desk, they're asking you to fill out all this paperwork. And underneath the desk, what you don't know is a high-powered X-ray is aimed right at your genitals. And you go home and all of a sudden you start blistering and you've had the effects of X-ray burn. And that was one mechanism they would use to sterilize people without their knowledge or consent. Another form of eugenic practice was, of course, the Nuremberg Laws, because the Germans were concerned about, the purity of the blood of the Volk, and therefore prevented extramarital relations between Jews and others who were not of German blood. And then among the many types of horrendous experiments that the Nazis conducted during the Holocaust, folks like Dr. Mengele and so on, was their experiments specifically using twins. Mengele in particular was obsessed with twin studies to figure out, what traits, are genetically linked or not. The one picture here of the liberation of Auschwitz, the two girls I've circled holding hands are two twin sisters who were experimented on. The one on the left, Eva Kor, was an outspoken Holocaust survivor, started a Holocaust Memorial Museum in Terre Haute, Indiana, and just died, I think, less than 2 years ago now. But both her and her sister were experimented upon by Mengele. So with that history in mind then, one thing that scholars have asked is, okay, what was so bad about the eugenics movement, right? If you ask anyone at the time, right, no one who does things that we consider morally wrong or evil, if we want to use that much more laden term, think that they're doing evil, right? They always think that they're doing good. And if we put aside the sort of outright horrific practices of the Nazis, or things like forced sterilizations in the US and elsewhere, what were they aiming at? And were some of the things that the eugenicists were aiming at actually good? So in this book called From Chance to Choice, the authors conducted an ethical autopsy of the eugenics movement. And they basically highlighted three main problems with the historical eugenics movement. Bad science, right? I mean, keep in mind, this is before Crick and Watson had even identified the DNA double helix. So the genetics knowledge being used was Mendelian, and we all know how imprecise that is. Racial prejudice, right? People were being targeted and being declared things like feeble-minded, imbecilic, idiots, maybe because they just don't have access to a good education. And a lot of racial minorities, especially in the US and other countries, don't have access to good education. So it's social structures that are causing people to exhibit signs that the experts, quote unquote experts, deem to be signs of feeble-mindedness, as they put it. And then finally, the overreaching of state authority with respect to reproductive autonomy. There are various other specific issues that they mention here, as you can see on the slide. So one of the questions that's come up really ever since the 1970s, when in vitro fertilization first came on the scene, and other forms of assisted reproductive technology, not to mention legalization of abortion in the US and expanding legalization in other countries, are such practices in which we do genetic testing or genetic screening and say only select certain embryos to be implanted in case of IVF, or terminate a pregnancy if a fetus is diagnosed with a certain type of congenital condition. Is this a new form of eugenics? And if it is, can we ethically carry out these practices without committing the errors of the old eugenics, right? So that's really the kind of question that bioethicists wrestle with today. Of course, there are, huge ethical debates about the morality of abortion. Who are generally against abortion may be okay with abortion for fetuses diagnosed with a certain type of congenital condition. So one's moral view on abortion as a whole doesn't necessarily dictate what one's view is going to be in this context. Okay, so So we're not doing the ethics of abortion here, just to be clear. So if we're going to talk, though, about genetic testing with selective abortion being an option, well, one way it avoids the errors of the old eugenics is the state is not involved in this anymore, because it's the parent or prospective parents making the choice, right? So it's their exercise of their own autonomy. And, the concern is not necessarily to, quote, rid society of people deemed to be, quote, life unworthy of life, but rather beneficence toward the potential child who's some bioethicists, such as Laura Purdy, have even gone so far as, while being clear that we shouldn't be passing any sort of laws restricting people's legal right to reproduce, she does argue that it can be immoral to reproduce under certain circumstances, when it's going to lead to the birth of a person who's going to be more likely to live a miserable as opposed to a happy life. She argues, potential persons do not have a right to be brought into existence, and there's not necessarily a right to reproduce, morally speaking. Again, she doesn't want the state to be restricting people's rights, ability to reproduce, but she's basically saying we should all be thinking about this morally, especially if you know that you have a hereditary condition that you might pass on to any future offspring. Julian Savulescu at Oxford has coined the term in this regard, procreative beneficence. Now, a huge objection to selection or to gene editing, or actually altering embryos, fetuses, or born children with CRISPR-Cas9 technology and so on, has been coming from the disability rights groups. And their biggest concern is that what are being diagnosed as being, quote, maladies, right? These negative conditions that impact one's ability to live a happy life, right? And Adrian Ash, who died a few years ago, a congenitally blind bioethicist, has been one of the foremost voices against this. And she's, again, right out front that she is pro-choice when it comes to abortion. She's not talking about, making abortion illegal or things like that. She's not morally opposed to abortion in general, but she thinks abortion for this particular purpose may be immoral, or can be, or was even more powerfully, often is immoral, because people make that decision without a lot of information about